Hello, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to present at this conference on climate actions and just transition. My name is Nicolás Vargas-Ramírez from the Centro de Investigaciones Multidisciplinarias sobre Chiapas y la Frontera Sur de la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, and I work on geospatial technologies and territorial defense with indigenous and local communities in Latin America. I want to begin with a statement that will guide my presentation. Geospatial technologies are not neutral instruments. Their development has historically served state and corporate interests, territorial control, resource extraction, military operations. For decades, the aerial perspective, the view from above, was a monopoly of powerful actors. But something has changed. In the last decade, small drones have become accessible to communities that were previously only objects of observation, never observers themselves. This creates both an opportunity and a challenge. Today, I will explore three interconnected themes. First, how community drones represent a counter-hegemonic remote sensing practice. Second, how engaged ethnography with drones can unveil hidden territorial dynamics. And third, how organized crime's appropriation of this technology threatens to reverse this democratization. I will argue that the just transition must include just skies, meaning equitable access to aerial monitoring technologies for environmental justice. Let me begin with community drones. We define community drone use as the utilization of a small and crude aircraft with or by indigenous and local communities, responding to their own needs and interests, not external agendas. This phenomenon emerged globally around 2012. The pioneer experiences took place in Indonesia, where communities used drones for land rights documentation. By 2014, the practice had expanded significantly in Latin America. Today, communities across the region use drones for environmental monitoring, countermapping, territorial defense, and natural resource management. A systematic review of global experiences between 2012 and 2017 reveals some important patterns. First, there was a clear concentration of initiatives in Latin America starting from 2014. Second, commercial multi-rotor drones became the most commonly used platforms, accessible and relatively affordable. However, the review also identified challenges. Most initiatives were driven by external agents, NGOs, researchers, conservation organizations, rather than emerging from communities themselves. And critically, local knowledge was often underutilized in the process. Communities received technical training, but their territorial expertise was not systematically integrated. This observation became central to my research. How can we better connect drone technology with the knowledge that communities already possess about their territories? Consider the alternatives. Satellite imagery requires expensive acquisition, complex processing, and technical expertise that communities rarely have. The temporal resolution is often inadequate. You cannot decide when to capture an image. Drones offer something different. Communities can fly when they need to. They can reach specific locations. They obtain immediate results with very high spatial resolution. And critically, they can document activities that are only visible from above. Illegal logging, unauthorized land clearing, water contamination, mining encroachment. These activities often remain invisible from the ground but become evident from the air. Based on experiences across the region, I identified several key opportunities. First, evidence generation. Drones produce legally valid documentation for judicial processes and territorial claims. High-resolution orthomosaics and georeferenced photographs have been admitted as evidence in environmental litigation. Second, governance strengthening. When communities produce their own spatial information, they strengthen territorial governance. They no longer depend entirely on external actors for basic geographic data about their own lands. Third, generational engagement. Young people often show great interest in drone technology. This creates opportunities to involve new generations in territorial management and environmental monitoring. Fourth, legitimacy building. When communities demonstrate technical capacity, they counter narratives that blame them for environmental degradation. They become recognized as legitimate stewards of their territories. This connects directly with equitable conservation. A just transition requires that communities become producers of environmental information, not merely recipients of data generated by others. But drone flights alone are not enough. The data requires interpretation, and interpretation requires methodology. This brings me to my second theme: engage ethnography with drones. What happens when we combine ethnographic methods with drone technology? We create what I call engaged remote sensing, an approach that integrates situated local knowledge with remotely sensed data. This addresses a limitation I have observed in many drone initiatives. Communities receive training, they fly, they capture images, but the connection with local knowledge is often weak. The drone becomes just another external tool rather than an extension of community observation practices. Engaged remote sensing seeks to change this. It positions the drone as an instrument for co-producing knowledge, where community perspectives guide every stage of the process. I propose organizing this approach in three phases: before takeoff, during flights, and after landing. Before takeoff is perhaps the most important phase. This is when participatory planning occurs. Communities collectively define the purposes of flights. They identify priority areas through participatory mapping. Local knowledge about actors, land uses, and territorial dynamics emerges in these discussions. The researcher, whether as a pilot, co-pilot, or observer, documents these conversations. Risk assessment happens collectively. Ethical considerations are discussed openly. During flights, the ethnographic observation continues. The researcher documents reactions, interactions, and spontaneous comments from community members watching the real-time transmission. These moments often reveal knowledge that would not emerge in formal interviews. After landing, participatory analysis begins. Communities interpret the image together. They validate or correct the researcher's interpretations. They make collective decisions about how information will be used and shared. This approach generates several important opportunities. It unveils territorialities, power dynamics, informal controls, and spatial relationships that remain invisible through conventional methods. Cartography alone misses the social meanings. Ethnography alone misses the spatial patterns. The combination reveals what neither could show independently. It enriches local spatial knowledge. Community members often discover aspects of their own territory they had not noticed before. It generates robust evidence for environmental conflicts. When communities control the entire process, from design to interpretation, the resulting documentation carries both technical validity and social legitimacy. This is data justice in action. Communities controlling the composition, access, and use of data about their territories. However, this progress faces a serious threat. Let me now address the dark side of drone democratization. The same characteristics that make drones valuable for communities, accessibility, portability, aerial perspective, have attracted organized crime. In Latin America, criminal organizations now use drones for territorial surveillance, including nighttime operations with thermal cameras. They conduct psychological operations using drones to intimidate communities and announce their presence. They monitor movements of authorities, journalists, and community monitors. In some countries, drones carry explosives or chemical agents. The intensity varies geographically. Mexico represents the epicenter, with the most advanced criminal drone operations. Peru and Panama show significant activity. Guatemala has growing adoption. Bolivia reports limited but emerging use. Border zones are especially affected. The Colombia-Peru-Brazil triple border, the Colombia-Panama corridor through Darien, and the Mexico-Guatemala frontier. Criminal groups have integrated drones into sophisticated technological ecosystems. They use satellite internet, particularly Starlink, for coordination. They employ commercial satellite imagery services, and some groups have better mapping capabilities than the state agencies pursuing them. This creates multiple challenges for legitimate community users. Regulatory challenges are perhaps most immediate. In response to criminal drone use, governments consider restrictive regulations. Licensing requirements become expensive and bureaucratic. In one country, accreditation costs reach $900, prohibitive for community monitors. Evidence gathered by non-licensed operators risks being invalidated in court. Operational challenges emerge on the ground. Criminal organizations actively recruit people with drone skills, sometimes through coercion. They install frequency jamming antennas that cause community drones to crash, a significant economic loss. Communities engage in self-censorship, reducing monitoring activities to avoid retaliation. And perception challenges affect the social meaning of the technology. Where drones once generated curiosity and interest, they now evoke fear. Community members associate the sound of drones with surveillance and threat, not with environmental monitoring. The fundamental problem is asymmetry. Criminal organizations have transnational resources to acquire advanced technology and evade any regulation. Communities depend on external funding and must navigate bureaucratic requirements designed without their participation. Restrictive regulations disproportionately affect legitimate users while barely inconveniencing criminal actors. If communities lose access to aerial monitoring tools, they lose a critical source of evidence for defending their territories against both illegal activities and legal but destructive projects. This brings me to my final section. What can be done? We must recognize that airspace has become a contested terrain. Indigenous communities, governments, conservation organizations, and criminal groups now compete for control of aerial perspectives. The vertical dimension of territory, long ignored in land rights discussions, demands attention. Who controls the sky above community lands? Who decides what can fly and what cannot? I propose several principles for just regulation. Recognition of indigenous territorial autonomy. International Labour Organization Convention 169 establishes the right of indigenous peoples to participate in decisions affecting their territories. This should extend to airspace regulation. Protection of environmental monitoring rights. Communities must retain the capacity to document activities affecting their lands, including from the air. Differentiation between legitimate and criminal uses. Regulations should target harmful applications, not to the technology itself. Community monitors should not be criminalized by association. Accessible licensing procedures. Accreditation requirements should be economically and culturally appropriate for community users. Across Latin America, organizations and communities are developing shared strategies. Networks for knowledge exchange are emerging. These spaces allow communities to share experiences, develop safety protocols, and advocate collectively for regulatory frameworks that protect their rights. The goal is to advance critical remote sensing grounded in place-based knowledge, supporting just transitions in environmental governance. Let me conclude by returning to my opening statement. Geospatial technologies are not neutral. They can serve domination or liberation, extraction or conservation, exclusion or justice. Community drones represent a counter-hegemonic remote sensing practice, a democratization of the aerial perspective. Engaged ethnography transforms these tools into instruments for co-producing territorial knowledge. But this progress is threatened. Criminal appropriation of drone technology is triggering regulatory responses that may criminalize legitimate community use. Addressing this requires differentiated frameworks that recognize indigenous territorial autonomy and protect communities' right to employ these technologies for environmental justice. A just transition must include just skies. Thank you. I welcome your questions and comments.